We're talking about that country as coalition forces end combat missions and begin a phased withdrawal from the country. Joining us here in Washington is Afghanistan's former ambassador to Canada and France, Omar. With us from London is a senior consulting fellow with Chatham House, Michael Keating. Also here in Washington is Andrew Wilder. He's with the United States Institute of Peace. And from Kabul, we're joined by Zardasht Shams. He's a former press counselor with the Afghan embassy in Pakistan. And as I mentioned, let's go to Michael Keating. Michael Keating, is it realistic to think that the Afghan government will one day be in total control of the country, or is it perhaps a better idea for the government to start talking about strong autonomous regions, a devolution of power, given the regional differences that we've heard about, the tribal differences that we've heard about?
Well, you know, all around the world, people in opposition talk about devolution of power when they're in opposition, but once they're in government, the idea looks less attractive. I think one of the things that unites all Afghans is quite a strong sense that Afghanistan should remain one country. There is a much stronger sense of nationalism today than I think there was in the past, and it's got very proud of its army, its football team, its cricket team, and so on. So I don't think anyone wants to see anything that would be conducive towards a breakup of the country. The issue is whether power can be deconcentrated to a certain degree so that government can be more responsive and closer to people. And I think Ashraf Ghani recognizes this. Things that sound quite technical but are very important, such as sub-national governance, budgeting, and so on, and making sure that resources do really get down to people at the community level, at the local level. But in the absence of technical capacity, this is not going to be easy. I think there's been a major positive development in the last couple of days, namely the announcement of a new government with a new bunch of ministers, some new faces as well as old faces. And I think, you know, in a way, your question is about whether the political space will be created for Afghanistan's technical and people and reformers to look at how the country can take advantage of its geographical location to put itself back on its feet, as and when the international community withdraws and the artificial economy that has sprung up around the presence of so many international troops, as that draws down.
Ambassador, Michael Keating makes a great point there about whether the advantages of peace has actually filtered down to the people in Afghanistan. Has there been a peace dividend that people can actually see?
Partially, yes. I can't say entirely because we still have a problem on our hands. But if you look at Afghanistan of 2001, when I returned and went back and compare it to Afghanistan of 2014, you feel that there has been a dividend. We can't call it a peace dividend, but there has been a dividend of sorts. And that obviously has been mostly as a result of the major international presence and investment in Afghanistan, as well as the will of the Afghan people to take charge and want change and reform, good governance after 30-something years of conflict. And I think that these two tendencies have created new opportunities. What we need to do, obviously, is to make sure that whatever gains we've had over the last few years are maintained and protected, and that we can expand this space, the space for the young to take part, to have opportunities, you know, for prosperity to grow, while we're still fighting, unfortunately. And this is going to be very difficult. And this is why the politics is going to be very tricky as well as essential. If our leadership in Afghanistan, this national unity government that has been formed, can prioritize properly, can manage and lead according to, you know, better standards compared to the previous regime, I think that there is a lot of hope. But if we fall into this sort of factional type of, you know, semi-conflict situation, then I think that we will have a tougher time. But there is hope, and I'm optimistic that we will get through this rough period, even though we don't know how long it might last.
Andrew Wilder, the politics of Afghanistan seems to be linked so closely to regional politics over there. So what role is there for countries, well, neighboring countries like Pakistan, especially India, and as we heard Michael Keating say earlier on, China wants to see a stable situation there as well?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, this is a regional conflict, and it has been for 30 years. And I think that needs to be recognized. And there won't be a solution to the conflict unless there's a regional solution. And I think there's more attention to that and more recognition of that. And I think it's a positive development that China has increased its engagement in this as well, in terms of both of offering its offices to facilitate a peace process, but also hopefully using its strong friendship with Pakistan to influence some of Pakistan's calculus in terms of what are its interests in Afghanistan. And certainly, you know, it's hard for me to look at Afghanistan and not feel that everyone loses if Afghanistan falls apart and doesn't, you know, achieve stability and peace, and everyone gains if it does. I mean, if Afghanistan falls apart, it's going to provide safe havens for Islamic militant groups in Pakistan. Already we're seeing a bit of that in some of the eastern provinces, and that could get a lot worse. You could see refugee outflows again into Pakistan, which doesn't have, I think, the capacity to host the number of refugees it did, you know, 3 decades ago when it had 3 million Afghan refugees arrive. So I think there is this interest, but again, this is where I think the Afghan government has a responsibility now to show that it can perform, that it's reached, you know, appointed its, you know, cabinet members. We still have a hurdle. The parliament has to approve those, but once we have a government in place, it needs to show that it's taking some steps to deliver better governance and get the support of its people. But I think then the regional and Afghanistan's neighbors really need to step up to the plate and recognize that stability is in their interests as well. And then the further afield friends of Afghanistan, as we've already noted, need to maintain their long-term support. And I think if we can align better governance on the part of the Afghan government with more regional support for stability in Afghanistan, and particularly from Pakistan, along with ongoing international support, I'm actually cautiously optimistic that we can achieve greater peace and stability in Afghanistan.
Michael Keating, the United States has a big say, of course, in the future of Afghanistan. And how much of a complication is the fact that there appears to be a difference of opinion here in Washington on the approach going ahead? I mean, we heard at the beginning of the program in our report there, President Obama expressed this optimism, expressed this positive spin on the fact that he thinks the future is secure. And then we heard the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey, say, well, I think the president is being a little bit too fast there.
Well, I'm flattered that you're asking me in London about politics in Washington, but with a little bit of perspective, I mean, first of all, clearly there's a US election coming up. We have a new Senate. But I think the argument that needs to be won in Washington is that a massive investment, both in terms of lives and money, that has been made in Afghanistan needs to be reinforced by continued support, albeit at much, much more modest levels, and that is the best possible way of shoring up the sacrifices and investments that have been made not only by the Americans but their allies, and indeed by the Afghans themselves. I think a particular problem that the US faces is that, unlike Europe, for example, the Europeans are, on the whole, the EU, the Scandinavian countries, the UK and so on, are in a position to make multi-year financial commitments which tend to survive electoral cycles, even though they are reviewed. Whereas in the US, you know, everything, as it were, has to be reviewed on a year-by-year basis. But I think DoD, Department of Defense support for continued financial subsidies to the Afghan National Security Forces is going to be fundamentally important. I do think that the US will have a major reputational problem on its hands, particularly with so many veterans around the country who have been wounded. Their families have lost loved ones. If Afghanistan goes wrong and questions are asked as to why a generation of young Americans and their families have paid such a high price for a political experiment that's gone so wrong, I think that will be very bad news. And I think there's also a review of the wisdom of going cold turkey on Afghanistan in the light of what's happening in Iraq. So I'm just hoping that those arguments will win the day.
Okay. Zardasht Shams, one of the political realities in Afghanistan is that the current president, Ashraf Ghani, draws most of his support from the Pashtuns. Those are most of the support from the south and east of the country. And then we have Abdullah, who draws most of his support from the Tajiks and other northern groups. And how do those tribal differences play into the future of the country and the politics of the country right now?
I think the establishment of the national unity government has proved all these speculations wrong, because both the teams were quite national. Both represented all ethnicities. Their vice presidents and now the cabinet, they have which they have now consensus, and they have introduced a new cabinet. It's widely, almost widely welcomed. So there are no concerns of some ethnic issues or ethnic problems. The concerns will be the economic transition that has to be taken place in the next course of in the future course, because the security transition already took place. But the problem is, as we discussed earlier, like the security situation, the Afghan security forces, they have the abilities, the motivation, and the resilience. But the problem is the technical, the weapons, the logistics. We have seen a recent Taliban major attack in the Kunar, in the eastern province of Kunar, which is bordering Pakistan. But there, the National Army supply line was almost broken by the insurgents. So the lack of air power and air support were the main factors of somehow failure. So now the future of the government, the ethnic issues, these are not now problems. Both the executive, the chief executive, and the president, they are moving quite well with support from the public. So I don't think there is a serious issue on these lines.
Okay, and we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us.